We are going to turn first to Jack Shonkoff, who's going to talk about research on the connections between poverty, trauma, and the developing brain, as well as other body systems, not just the brain.
Terrific. Thanks, Chris. I really appreciate the invitation to be here and delighted to share the stage with Swati. So, as Chris said, my talk is going to focus on advances in the biology of adversity and resilience and how this can kind of really increase our understanding of the early origins of inequalities in life outcomes across a broad range of areas. So basically, there's a revolution going on in 21st century science, particularly in biology right now. And it's giving us much greater insight into the origins of disparities in learning behavior and health. So I'm going to present three basic concepts that really crystallize a huge amount of decades of research that have brought us to where we are right now. The first, I think, this increasing public understanding about how early experiences literally shape the architecture of the developing brain, and a lot of our policies in the early childhood area have been kind of grounded in this understanding of how early experiences basically affect the brain. But what we've been learning in an avalanche of research in the last 2 decades is that the brain is connected to the rest of the body, so that early experiences not only affect the developing brain, they affect the immune system, they affect metabolic systems, they affect the cardiovascular system. And so first take-home message here from cutting-edge biological science is that early childhood policies and programs and really focusing on the origins of inequalities early in life are as much about lifelong health as they are about early learning and about school readiness. The second basic concept, if you can click, thank you, is this notion of variation and sensitivity to the environment. So we know that environments affect all aspects of learning and development and health, but everything is determined by the interaction between environmental experiences and exposures and genetic variation, differences in how individuals are more or less sensitive to the environment. So this has very important implications on the policy and the program end. First, increasing attention is being given to this notion of the social determinants of health, poverty, systemic racism, exposure to violence, all increasing the risk for inequalities. But that's only half the story, because there are many children living in poverty. There are many children whose families are struggling with the threats of racism, but who are not showing evidence of significant disruption in their development. In the same way, there are children living in very wealthy and well-educated families with lots of resources who have problems. So anything that focuses on using demographic variables as markers of risk need to understand that those are population level indicators, and at an individual level, we have tremendous variation. In the same way, if we ask questions about what is the best policy, what is the best program for children in poverty to reduce inequalities? Well, that was a good 20th century question. 21st century science says it's the wrong question. The question should be, what, for any given policy or program, for whom is it having large effects? For whom is it having modest effects? For whom is it having no effects? This is really a core principle of what we understand about health and development as it unfolds over the life course. And then the third concept, if we can have the next clip, thank you, is this notion of the importance of timing and critical periods in development. So once again, we start with the brain as kind of a general understanding among people who are kind of closely involved in thinking about early development, is that there are critical or sensitive periods very early in life for brain development related to sensory systems, early aspects of language development, where there's a period in which the brain for those functions is optimally responsive to the environment, for good or for bad. If the environment is growth promoting, you build strong circuits. If the environment is threatening or filled with hardships, those circuits can be weakened. And then the critical or sensitive period passes, and you can't go back and rewire. You can adapt, you can kind of always make things better, but they would never have been as good as they would have been if you had gotten it right the first time. Well, now we know that it's not just the brain for which there are important timing issues related to critical periods. The immune system has critical periods in terms of its early exposure to the environment of bacteria and viruses that we all are exposed to, and metabolic systems that kind of regulate the way in which our body uses energy have early experiences that create patterns that are difficult to change later. All of these systems are reading the environment early on. They're adapting to be able to promote optimal health and development in whatever environment children live in. And the immune system and the metabolic systems are particularly kind of sensitive in the prenatal period and in the first 2 years after birth. So we ignore those at our peril. If we think about early childhood policies focusing largely on preschool for 3 and 4-year-olds, which is obviously much better than waiting for kindergarten, I kind of salute that without question. But for children facing the greatest hardships, there are important missed opportunities at a much earlier age, prenatally and in the first 2 years, where critical periods can be missed. Kind of next slide, please. So now I'm going to give you in this next slide a kind of a 90-second crash course in the biology of adversity and resilience to basically give you a sense of how much we are learning and how much this frontier is moving about how excessive stress gets into the body and can undermine the foundations of healthy development. So everything, as I said before, is the result of an interaction between, if I have the next click, genetic variation, environmental stressors, and developmental timing all interact and all have an impact on early learning and behavior and lifelong health. You cannot look at only one dimension of this. But when there is elevated adversity, when there are threats to healthy development, the early origins of inequalities. So what's going on inside the body? So next click, please. So there are multiple dimensions of the stress response system. Next click, please. One is the elevation in stress hormone levels circulating in the body and the blood. I think those who have some familiarity with this would recognize that cortisol, which is a stress hormone, is one example of that. Next click, please. Elevations in heart rate and blood pressure are another part of the stress response system. And I should say, for those of you who are listening, when I talk about stress, I'm not talking about the cause of stress. I'm talking about the body's response to stress, the physiological response to stress. So I can't see who's out there listening. I'm sure I don't personally know most of you, or maybe hardly any of you, but I do know that since you are successful, kind of surviving adults, you know what stress feels like. So we all know when we are significantly stressed, we know there's a physical feeling. What I'm now walking you through is what's going on inside your body that's creating that physical feeling. So elevated stress hormones, elevated heart rate and blood pressure. Next click, please. There's an inflammatory response, which is the immune system's first response to stress. Next click. Metabolic regulation is activated. The inflammatory system prepares your body to kind of deal with injury and to be protective against infection. Metabolic regulation is mobilizing energy sources, so your blood sugar level goes up to deliver increased levels of glucose all through your body for the fight or flight response. Next click, please. So one of the most exciting areas in molecular biology is this notion of epigenetics, which is kind of how we understand literally at the molecular level how experience actually affects gene expression, turns genes on or off, and also affects the pacing at which the genetic material ages. So chronic activation of the stress response system actually accelerates the aging process at a molecular level, which is helping us understand biologically why people who've had significant adversity and trauma all through their lives look older than they are and don't live as long. It's a wear and tear effect on the body. And then the next click, please. So there are effects, EEG effects on the electrical activity in the brain circuitry. So all of these dimensions of the stress response system show us that this is not just about the brain, it's about many systems. So let me have the next click, please. I'll give you an example of the connection with early development and with lifelong health. So stress hormones, particularly cortisol, when that is elevated in the acute situation, stress system is our friend. It's life-saving. We would be in big trouble if we didn't have a stress response system. So when stress hormones are elevated, they make us more alert. They kind of mobilize energy stores, making it optimally ready to kind of deal with stress. The problem is the stress system wasn't designed to be activated all of the time. And if it's excessively elevated for prolonged periods of time, that can then shift from helping you deal with fight or flight to having, again, a wear and tear effect on the body. So when the stress hormone levels stay up, then they actually start to suppress immune responses. They affect different circuits in the brain related to attention and memory and higher level cognitive functions that can impair your ability to focus your attention. And they change the threshold for stress activation so that you are more susceptible to kind of have your stress system activated when you're older as a result of too much activation when you're younger. This is the body's way of preparing for a world that seems to always be threatening. You can have the next click. So inflammation, which is a wonderful thing to have in an acute threatening situation because it prepares your body to kind of deal with injury rapidly. It prepares your body to deal with infection in case you are injured. That's great. But inflammation needs to come down. When inflammation stays up for prolonged periods of time, it has a whole host of disruptive effects on many organ systems. It accelerates atherosclerosis, making you more likely to get heart disease. It's associated with greater risk for depression and greater risk for dementia. Kind of decades later, it's associated with more likelihood of arthritis, a whole host of autoimmune diseases. Inflammation is one of the most active areas of biomedical research right now, associated with many, many chronic diseases. Next circle, next click. So metabolic regulation in the acute stressful situation, we need elevated blood sugar for energy to deal with threat. But if that continues to be activated, then it leads to a greater risk for insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, obesity, type 2 diabetes, and there we are. All of these systems that help you acutely, if they stay activated, they increase your risk for a whole host of stress-related diseases over a lifetime, decades after the experiences early in life. You can go to the next slide, please. So if we're talking about inequalities, and we're talking about the extent to which significant adversity early in life increases the risk for inequalities in health and educational outcomes, we need to confront the fact that chronic adversities impose disproportionate stresses on families of color. This is taken from one study that represents a whole extensive literature that if you look at differences among Black families, Latinx, and white families, Black and Latinx families have much more exposure to multiple adversities than white families with comparable SES. Neighborhood violence is a much greater presence in the lives of Black families relative to Latinx families and white families related to neighborhood segregation. Next click, please. All of these things are telling us that it's any single adversity doesn't kind of do us in. We're not that fragile as a species. If we were, we would have been extinct a long time ago. But it's the pile up, the cumulative impact of multiple adversities. And we know without any question that the combination of the threats and hardships related to racism and poverty and violence and housing instability and food insecurity, and the list could go on, all of those affect early learning, behavior, and lifelong health. And the higher the burden of adversity, the greater the risk for a whole host of diseases and educational difficulties relating to the theme of this conference, which is inequalities, and particularly related to poverty for today's presentations. Can I have the next slide, please? So those of you who are familiar with the early childhood field, know, I'll tell you personally for myself, I'm a pediatrician by training. I've been involved in this field for most of my career. For me, the motivation was the moral responsibility for assuring a level playing field for all children as early as possible. But I learned over time that to get a big tent on this, there's also an economic return on investment issue here, which is very important and not to be underestimated. So we know from effective interventions early in life that the savings can be considerable in terms of greater educational achievement, greater economic productivity, and actually one of the most expensive consequences is incarceration, which has been associated with a significant adversity early in life, and particularly with trauma, complicated by huge racial inequities in the rate of incarceration in this country. But now if we take this larger lens, which 21st century science is screaming at us, that this is not just about learning, And it's not just about school readiness. It is about those issues, but it is also about lifelong health. So if we look at the issue of early childhood investments that, based on what I've shared with you so far, investments in policies and programs that protect biological systems from toxic stress will reduce inequalities and generate substantial returns on investment that we have not been calculating to date in healthcare costs. So if you look at the most, if you have the next click, actually you can do the next three, 1, 2, and 3. If we look at the most costly diseases that are paid for by our healthcare system, which is kind of a huge share of certainly of state budgets and a large expenditure in the federal budget, is that cardiovascular conditions, diabetes, and depression, which are 3 of the 5 most costly illnesses, chronic impairments, are all associated with increased risk beginning very early in life relating to adversity. So if I could have the next click, the take-home message here is that science-informed investments that reduce hardships and adverse exposures faced by pregnant women and families raising young children offer an incredibly promising pathway for enormous savings in healthcare costs that will dwarf the savings that we have been calculating so far in economic productivity and even in incarceration. As expensive as incarceration is, I don't know, it's not news to anybody in this audience how expensive healthcare costs are. So if I could go to the next slide now, and coming close to the end of this presentation, I'd like you to kind of think a bit about inequality, issues related to inequality, and the particular circumstances of COVID-19 that we're facing right now, and looking at that through an early childhood lens. And there were 3 kind of take-home messages that I'd like to share with you. You can have the first one. So disparities associated with poverty and racism and other structural inequities that have been glaringly evident in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on our population here in the United States and around the world. These are not new. Racial and socioeconomic disparities are not new, but is a very important lesson coming from how we're understanding these gross inequalities and the impacts of COVID-19 about variation in susceptibility to illness. Okay, so we know there's tremendous variation related to age. There's tremendous variation related to exposure to the virus based on where people work and whether they have the options to work at home and whether they have to take public transportation. And tremendous variations related to pre-existing medical conditions. So just to talk about something like COVID-19 doesn't tell us the more important story, which is how do we understand differential response to treatment? Why do we have higher death rates among some part of the population? And differential impacts of adversity on health. This is part of the same story about how we can't talk just generally about trauma and social determinants without understanding the variation within the population. So pre-existing medical conditions that impose the highest risk for adults in the face of COVID-19, which include obesity, hypertension, heart disease, diabetes. Well, I think all of you can now finish this paragraph. Those diseases are associated with excessive stress activation early in life. So we can see that the pre-existing medical conditions that differentiate response to COVID-19 have their origins early in life. And it really kind of reinforces again and again about adult health conditions, particularly those related to adversity, don't begin in the adult years. And if we're going to be thinking about health promotion and disease prevention, an emphasis on better eating habits and exercise for 30 and 40-year-olds is to kind of understate the issue is not starting early. That's not prevention. If we could have the third click on this slide in terms of looking at COVID-19 through an early childhood lens. You can have the next hit. So for those people who are paying attention to children, and unfortunately children have not been the focus of attention in this pandemic, and certainly not very young children. Very young children are have been almost invisible, except around the childcare issue, mostly like how do we get first responders and people back to work. But it's really important for people to understand everything I've shared with you so far, is that the level of adversity experienced by young children in this context is a time bomb for problems. Not for everybody, there's going to be variation, but we're not paying enough attention to asking, how can we protect the physical health and the mental health and the early learning capacity of very young children who are fairly invisible in this pandemic? And the answer to that question, which is basic biology of development, is if we want to pay attention to the health and well-being of young children, we have to pay attention to the health and well-being of the adults who care for them. That's the key to protecting developing biological systems in young children. So let me go to the next slide, and I'm just about finished. So all of this science, and I'm really just kind of touching at superficial themes here. There's so much more detail and complexity, and the scientists who are working at the frontiers will be the first ones to tell you they're barely scratching the surface. That's what's so wonderful about scientists. They're never happy with what they know. They always want to know more and more. So this is an area of knowledge that is going to be exploding over the next 10 or 20 years easily. If we try to extract from this very complicated science, there are three science-based principles that are fairly straightforward that sit on the top of all this complex science, that can be used to strengthen the foundations of healthy development across policies and programs. This is not just about healthcare, it's about early care and education, it's about human services, it's about family support, it's about home visiting programs. All of these policies and programs across sectors can draw on this very rich and rapidly moving science to focus on three principles that can help to improve the impacts of what we're doing in any of these domains. So next tip. The first is supporting responsive relationships. Responsive, nurturing relationships between young children and the adults who are caring for them are a major buffer against trauma and adversity in terms of it getting inside the body of young children. Second, next tip, obviously reducing sources of stress. So one could have said, well, it would really be for families experiencing the greatest inequalities and the greatest pressures related to poverty and racism and other structural inequities. If we could reduce sources of stress on families, we would make it easier for families to buffer their children against the effects of stress, which get into their bodies because it affects family dynamics. So this starts with basic needs that we're particularly attentive to in this environment. Food insecurity, housing stability, economic stability, including issues related to potential sources of violence. And every program and policy could be looking at how is it making life easier for people who need services by making the administrative burden easier. All of these things, the science says, will actually help reduce the threats to children's well-being. And the third, you can have the next click, is strengthening core skills. So young children do not grow up in a vacuum. They grow up in an environment of relationships. And the adults who kind of manage that caregiving environment need the skills to kind of create a pretty well-regulated, predictable, safe, and stable daily experience. And they also are the source of scaffolding and modeling the development of those skills in young children in the early childhood period. And these are the building blocks of resilience. So you could look at these three issues, which are necessarily simplified, and say, well, duh. So, okay, so what's so new about that? Well, if I could have the next click, the devil's in the details. Yeah, we know that this is what makes for effective policies and programs. The challenge is, how do we make that happen? And how do we make that happen in a highly diverse population where biology tells us no one size fits all? We have to understand variation in response to the environment, which includes variation in response to interventions. So last click. For those of you who want more detail on the science, our website is filled with material for people like you to make complicated science accessible and understandable to non-scientists. And this working paper number 15, paper that was just released in June, will give you much more detail on what I've discussed in this webinar, a paper entitled Connecting the Brain to the Rest of the Body, Early Childhood Development and Lifelong Health are deeply intertwined. So here's the website if you'd like more material. And I look forward to Swati's comments and the conversation we'll have together. Thanks again, Chris, for the invitation to be part of this session.